Believe it or not, Cathie Wood actually has a new top stock in her flagship ARK Innovation ETF. It's a stock that has been crashing a lot, but she's been buying up a huge amount of shares, and it's actually become the #1 largest holding in her ETF, even zooming past the almighty Tesla. So in today's video, I'm going to let you guys know if I think that this is a stock worth buying on the dip right now as a long-term investment. It's going to be a fun one. Got a few things to talk about. Let's not waste any time. Let's get started with this video. What's up everyone, my name is Ale. Welcome back to my world of stocks. Yes, of course, the stock that we are talking about today is Zoom Video Communications, ticker symbol ZM. It's grown by a lot of popularity for obvious reasons. We'll talk about all of that. We're going to take a look at how it's become a even larger holding than Tesla for Cathie Wood's flagship ETF. We're going to talk about why the stock has been crashing, why people have been buying it, what is the upside, what is the downside. Is it worth the risk as a long-term investment? Could be a great opportunity, might not be worth touching. I'm going to talk about all of that in today's video and let you know exactly what I plan to do myself with this stock. So let's go ahead and jump straight into this. Okay, so as you guys know, Cathie Wood is famous for her innovation-focused investments, and the largest, most popular of those is her flagship ARKK Ark Innovation ETF, which unfortunately has been crashing very hard recently. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still up over 60% in the past 5 years, but this was really a high-flying ETF that everyone was crazy about just about a year or two ago, but now it's crashed by over 70% from its highs. That's pretty crazy. Now, as far as the top holdings go, Cathie has always been famous for being one of the biggest bulls on Tesla stock, so that's been pretty consistently her #1 largest holding, but they recently got dethroned by Zoom Video Communications, as Tesla's stock has been getting crushed in recent weeks. From its highs, Tesla has now fallen by close to 40%. We'll probably have to talk about that in an upcoming video. But one thing I do want to mention is that Zoom has actually fallen by even more than that, which I will show you in just a second. But the reason why it's making up more for ARK despite the bigger drop is because Cathie Wood has been simply buying a lot more of it in recent months. In fact, if we look at a recent list of her Zoom purchases, it equates to the buying of literally hundreds of thousands of new shares. And as a result, Zoom has overtaken Tesla as the fund's largest holding at a whopping 9.5% of the ETF. Now, just so you know, she does have a rule where she tries to keep every stock at less than 10% of the ETF. So you'll probably see buying slow down right now, because she's really right near the limit of it. But that's still pretty high. Now, Tesla, of course, comes in at #2 at around 8.6%, and then you've got Roku at 8%, and then everything else is either at or below 5%. So this is a really, really big holding for her. It's has a really big weight in the ETF. Now, going back to Zoom, like I mentioned before, their stock has actually crashed by even more than Tesla in recent months, and it's currently down an absolutely massive over 80% from its highs. I mean, guys, this is a stock that was at one point trading for almost $600 a share, almost 600, and today it's only at about 100. And yet, despite that massive crash, the stock is actually still up by over 50% from when they IPO'd back in 2019. So it just really shows how incredibly high it was climbing during the pepperoni global health issue. And in case you're new to the channel, the reason I use words like pepperoni or global health issue is because YouTube tends to be a little strict about what I can and cannot say about the whole, this whole situation and the algorithm. I personally think that it hurts my videos if I talk about it too much. So that's why I use those words. But anyway, going back to the stock crash, why did it even fall by this much in the first place? Well, during the health issue and the resulting lockdowns and the huge increase in remote work and remote learning, Zoom's video communications platform saw a giant increase in demand, which sent the stock climbing by close to 700% at one point. And at those levels, it was just way too overhyped, and it was pretty clearly in a bubble. I mean, during their highest levels, the PE ratio was over 2,000. That's a ridiculous valuation, and it really needed to come back down to reality. Now, today, it sits around the mid-20s, and I think that's much more reasonable. And the same thing can also be said about their price-to-sales ratio, which reached ridiculously high levels of the 120s before crashing all the way back down to just the single digits where they sit today at right around 8. That's much more reasonable. But believe it or not, even after this massive crash, Zoom is still trading fairly expensive compared to the rest of the sector, as their PE ratio is around 20 to 50% more expensive, and their PS ratio is almost 150% more expensive as well. However, the Zoom bulls would argue that a premium does need to be paid for a company like this because of their explosive growth and their future potential. So, is that true and the stock is now at an amazing discount that needs to be bought? Or is it still an overhyped stock without as much firepower as people would like to think? Well, let's take a closer look. Now, back in 2019, their sales soared by almost 90%. Then they flew to the moon in 2020 during the pepperoni lockdowns, and with everything going remote and all that other stuff, that sent their sales skyrocketing by over 320%. And then last year, they still managed to grow by over 50%, which was a large deceleration in growth, but that was really to be expected coming off of such explosive growth in 2020. Now, the problem, however, comes with this year and the next, where growth is coming to a screeching halt. I mean, this year is expected to see growth of only around 11%, while next year will still be in the low teens at just around 13%. And don't get me wrong, double digit growth, that's usually a good thing, but this is a company that should be growing higher for the price that you pay for it and for what they've done in the past and for the market and all that kind of stuff. This growth is really too low, in my opinion. I mean, just for example, compare that to one of their biggest competitors in Microsoft, who did close to $200 billion in sales over the past year, while Zoom only did about $4 billion, and yet Microsoft is actually still outgrowing them with a much higher rate of 18% expected this year versus only 11% for Zoom. And really, this is my personal biggest concern for Zoom going forward, is the massive competition that they're going to have to deal with. When you think about it, Zoom doesn't really have anything special going on that can't be easily replicated, especially by massive behemoths like Microsoft, who not only has more cash than they know what to do with, but I would argue that they also have a competitive advantage with their Teams platform because it can be heavily integrated with Microsoft Office. And if you know anything about Office, it's that nearly every major corporation and even a ton of small businesses too use at least some form of Office software or even Outlook email in their daily practice. In fact, Microsoft holds the most Office productivity software market share in the world, with the only real competitor being Google in what is essentially a worldwide duopoly. And speaking of Google, by the way, they too have a competitor platform to Zoom called Meet, which they've been consistently investing more money into and also updating its software to better run with their Office productivity software, just like what Microsoft does. And hey, while we're making comparisons here, might as well toss Google back into those financial comparisons as well, because Google actually generates even more revenue than Microsoft by close to $80 billion more. And yet, if you think that's crazy, just look at their growth estimates. Google is expected to grow sales this year by close to the same percentage as Microsoft, which is also higher than Zoom still. And both Google and Microsoft are even growing their profits by a larger percentage than Zoom as well. So it's not even like you've got this tiny company in Zoom that is seeing explosive growth. Over the next 5 years, Zoom is only expected to grow their earnings per share by 14% on average, while Microsoft is expected to do 16% and Google is expected to do a whopping 17%. As a result, even their valuations are cheaper than Zoom. Google carries a 5-year PEG ratio, a price to earnings to growth ratio, of less than 1. Do you have any idea how cheap that is for a massive company like Google that is still growing by double-digit percentages? I mean, a PEG ratio of less than 1 is generally considered a good value for really any stock, but for such a dominant company like Google to be trading that low, it's pretty unbelievable. And Microsoft isn't too far away either at a PEG of just 1.7, but Zoom, they're almost at 3.5, so they're much higher. So when you look at analyst price targets, I gotta say it does make sense that Google is currently trading well below even the lowest price targets. The same thing can be said about Microsoft, but Zoom is actually still higher than their lowest target and not too far away from their average either, despite the massive crash. Now, granted, analysts get things wrong all the time, and because Zoom traded so incredibly high very recently, there is good reason to believe that they could once again reach at least those levels or close to those levels in the future, especially if another global health issue happens where things lock back down again and we have to go back to remote work and remote learning. If you see an acceleration in Zoom's growth once again, all those things could be major catalysts for the stock to shoot right back up again. But even now, both of those markets, the remote work, remote school, all that kind of stuff, they're still super heavily prevalent. So I'm not so sure that we're going to see another gigantic growth spurt like we did in 2020. According to Fortune, close to 40% of workers between ages 20 and 64 are still working remotely, and nearly half of all American workers say that they expect to work at least some part of the time remotely, according to Gartner research going forward. So it's already a massive, gigantic market, and it's one that Zoom already controls the most market share of in 44 different countries around the world. Now, you would think that that's a great thing, and it is, definitely is. However, it's also a little bit of a cause of concern for me because reason number one, that means that there's market share for other companies to steal. And reason number two, Microsoft and Google are already pretty close to them, and they're doing a pretty good job of competing. In fact, Microsoft Teams alone controls 41 countries, and if you combine it with Skype, which they also own, then Microsoft actually controls more countries than even Zoom. And even Google already has 21 countries just on their own, despite being one of the newest players to enter the market. And this isn't even considering the countless number of new applications and platforms that are very likely to rise in the coming years and offer maybe competitive pricing, maybe special deals to compete, all of which I think has the potential to at least put some pressure on Zoom's margins. I'm not saying Zoom is going to, just fall away, but they are going to have a lot of competition, and that may put pressure on their growth. It may put pressure on their profitability, things that, you should probably be aware of. So at the end of the day, is Zoom stock worth investing in? Maybe. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue against it right now considering how much it's fallen. Could be a good deal. The stock used to be trading so incredibly higher very recently, and it's crashed by so much that if we start to see an acceleration in their growth again, if you have any kind of catalyst coming into play where maybe lockdowns come back or there's another kind of global health issue, then don't be surprised if the stock skyrockets once again. I mean, right now it's probably super heavily shorted, so it might not take too much to kind of spark a rebound in the stock. I think the biggest thing would be a reacceleration in their growth. If we start to see that, analysts will probably start to upgrade the stock. Anyone who's shorting it are going to have to start covering, and the stock could, you could definitely see a short squeeze and the stock could fly to the moon once again. That is a very real possibility, and I understand why people like the stock at these levels from a risk reward kind of viewpoint or ratio. But for me personally, I still think that this is more of a gamble, more of a bet than really a long-term investment. I mean, if you're looking at Zoom, if you're really invested in Zoom as a long-term investment, you would have to explain to me why you don't also own Microsoft and Google and maybe Facebook and some others, because these are much safer, much larger, much more diversified companies that are actually trading at even better valuations and actually have more growth right now. So from the viewpoint of just where we're at right now, I can't really understand why you would invest in Zoom as a long-term investment and not these other companies. Now, you might own all of them and you might think that the market is big enough to support multiple players, and that's probably true. But I just think that I already get enough exposure to the stay-at-home market or whatever you want to call that. It's a massive market. It's going to get even bigger in the future. There's no doubt about that. I really think it's where the future is headed in many different ways. I'm not personally a big fan of that, but I think that's where we're headed. And but by owning Microsoft and Google already, like I do, I feel that that gives me enough exposure to that market. I don't really need the global leader right now that is at risk of losing more market share to these other giant companies that have all the cash in the world to beef up their infrastructure and their platforms and to heavily compete and offer better deals and all kinds of stuff. There's going to be a lot of competition in this market. I sleep like a baby at night owning stocks like Microsoft and Google because I'm almost guaranteed that over the long term, I'm going to make a profit on these investments. Are you guaranteed that with Zoom? Probably not. It's not a bad bet. I'm not saying it's a bad bet. I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy Zoom stock. And like I said, it could really fly to the moon at any moment. And at which point I might look like an idiot by saying that I'm not buying Zoom stock. But look, I just feel very comfortable right now with the lower risk and still very high reward that I get with stocks like Microsoft and Google at today's prices. Their valuations are trading so low. I don't think it's going to stay that way. I think over the long term, these are stocks that are going to be high flying once again. And that's where I'd rather have my money. So I'll be staying on the sidelines in terms of Zoom stock. I don't hate it. I don't have anything against them, but I just think that there's better options. And I think that there's safer ones where I sleep better at night and still give me plenty of exposure to that market. I'm not at a point where I don't have any exposure to it and I need to go pick up something like Zoom. I've got plenty of exposure to that market. I don't really need Zoom. So that's just how I feel. I hope I made some sense there. But if you guys disagree with anything I said, please let me know down in the comment section. I'd love to have that conversation with you guys. I'd love to hear your perspective and why you think that Zoom stock is a better investment, or like I said, maybe you own multiple of these companies and you just really believe in the future of this market and you think it's going to support many players. So you'd rather just load up on several different stocks for maybe a few different reasons. I'd love to hear those thoughts. So let me know down in the comment section. Let me know if there's any other stocks you'd like me to share my opinion on in the future, but I hope you're all doing well, and I will catch you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.